Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult video number 243, a true new age for the occult. Just some meanderings into the topic of technology, actually. Because you've got to understand, when people a century ago, a bit more now, about 120 years ago, were talking about the new age, the Aquarian age, the age of Aquarius, all of this sort of stuff that they were speaking of. They were hyper-optimistic about the future of mankind, in part because of technological advances that started happening in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. And indeed, there was an awakening of consciousness at the time. It wasn't always completely accurate in their descriptions in the Western world, Western Europe, and the United States especially, of foreign spiritual systems. A lot of them were entering the Western consciousness for the first time, and people were trying to correlate things, compare different religions, spiritual systems, and find sort of the lost ages from the past. They were trying to find the golden age and try to return to it, despite the fact that it wasn't always accurate, and there was a bit of hyperbole, and certainly there were charlatans involved. The consciousness of people of the occult, of the mystic, of the pagan especially, and of spiritual systems outside of Judeo-Christianity was vastly expanded. You had as well the arrival of a burgeoning middle class, literate working class. Literacy began to expand rapidly, and so in a way you did have a new age. Education, an understanding of scientific truth, logic, reason, all of these things began to expand into groups of people that it hadn't before. We now have a true new age, which is that is actually happening today. And it's happening semi-silently. A lot of people don't understand. In the wake of the internet, especially, the world is now encountering even more spiritual systems. Even when you look on the boob tube, television, what do you see? There's a lot of interest in spirituality. You think of 2012, the Mayan calendar, end times. Well, the real use of that was people were learning a bit about Mayan spirituality, even if they were just getting it from debunking videos pointing out, hey, by the way, there are longer counts than the long count, the Baktun that is being referenced in regards to this supposed end time that won't actually happen, which is something I stressed as well. We're now moving back into the 20s. What an auspicious time. The 1920s were great as far as the occult went. And as far as Art Deco, flappers, and the mass expansion of electricity, lowering of infant mortality, the development of all sorts of cool technology happened in the 20s. Probably, if I could go back in time to any decade for a day, it'd be the 1920s. The 80s would be a close second. They're sort of like the 20s with neon and early wave analog computers. But here's the thing. Back then, the mass expansion of human spiritual consciousness was the result of encountering foreign groups for the first time. And this was done by academics and brought back to the lay people back in these cultures. Archaeology had been expanding in the wake of the Napoleonic era. There was a renewed interest in discovering the roots of Christendom, discovering the Holy Grail or El Dorado, some of these legends, King Arthur and the Holy Grail and stuff. And all of this human interest expanded real education, real consciousness. In some cases, some religious zealot was the one that found the ruins. The mummy was found by someone who was actually looking for the Ark of the Covenant, but ended up finding a bunch of mummies and tombs instead. The consciousness of the world was vastly increased, and literacy began to rise, and these things became hip. They became fashionable for a time. For about 20 years, it was quite fashionable to be interested in these things. A lot of the occult literature at the time, which is some of the stuff I myself now am editing, was literally meant for the lower classes. It was really, in some cases, I'm going through these books, and this is a big part of this video as well. I'm going through these occult editions. There are all sorts of horrible grammatical mistakes, misspellings of words in the most basic sense. There was apparently a lack of type editing at the time. This is because they were lower budget. They were produced by lay people. They weren't produced by some academic in an ivory tower who checked and triple-checked his work to make sure everything, all the I's were dotted and T's crossed. It was somebody who was slapping something together for a lower-class audience, part of that new audience, especially of working and middle-class individuals, including female readers for the first time that were interested in these subjects. You have the same thing now. There are parts of the world that are virtually uncontacted by the average person. The only tales that we have of some of these outlying regions of the third world, in regards to their spirituality, their literary traditions, their spirituality, is through people who are either wealthy expats, and they travel there and they do their documentaries for YouTube or whatever, recreationally, or from people that are in academics, or government occasionally. That's all we have. That's beginning to change. That literature is trickling in on the internet now day by day. We have an expansive library of hundreds of thousands of religious and spiritual and occult texts available for anybody in the world to read, increasingly being edited, like I'm doing, into modern form for the English-speaking world, in my case, being translated into foreign languages, stored and retrieved for free or for small amounts of money anywhere in the world. The internet is like electrification 100 years ago. We now have internetification, if you'll term it. And it's beginning to spread out to parts of the world that even 10 years ago, when the internet was already prevalent in the US and Western Europe and stuff when I arrived, if I look at the places that were looking at my content, just on a geomaps or analytics on YouTube or Facebook or whatever, the difference is astonishing. The number of countries in the world that were severely underrepresented 10 years ago has been cut in half, easily. You have a bunch of people, there are a bunch of people watching my material just as a single individual from places like Nigeria, from India and Vietnam, places that back then, 10 or even 5 years ago, it was more sparse. Parts of Eastern Europe, certainly, and those religious and spiritual traditions which are held by these people are increasingly becoming available to other audiences. They're being compared to other spiritual systems. They're entering that great lexicon of mystic discussion, which are both positive things. You've also got the growth of cosmopolitanism within religion. You've got a world religion after a fashion. In a democratized sense, you have everything available to everyone at all times to peruse, and it expands their consciousness. And I'm not saying they should be fused together. That's a more central idea. I'm simply saying that they're there for people to study. Spirituality has been enhanced by this. I believe that spirituality is actually, in the sense, globalism as a phenomenon, I've spoken of this, I oppose. I don't like the idea of trying to amalgamate and homogenize people, erase their cultures, their religions, and so forth. But making them available so that other people can look upon them and appreciate them, study from them. They can be astonished by what they're reading. They can be interested, intrigued. Maybe it can lead to them connecting some distant spiritual system with theirs. It can lead them to develop some new technology or philosophical school or write a book. It's great. It really is a new sort of Aquarian age. This is exactly the kind of thing that was predicted over 100 years ago by people in the Victorian era, and even in times slightly before that. Oh, in the coming age, literacy will take off. People will communicate at a distance. They thought it'd be through telepathy. It turned out to be through instant messaging. Everything that they predicted is actually here. Science has fused with spirituality once again. Our job, or I would say in my case, my job, is to promulgate that material the way that I do. I'm making it available in some cases for the first time in modernity. Some of these books have never had a modern edition. I'm editing books from the 1800s, for which the only extant physical editions are very, very old and in poor shape. I'm trying to release new ones so that there will be something that 100 years from now hopefully will be in better condition than these editions that I'm currently working with. That's the whole goal. There are people translating, there are people illustrating, there are people doing scientific and linguistic studies of all of these various documents. You've had various educational edifices taking texts that in some cases haven't even yet been translated and attempting to work with them for the first time. You've got the digitization of a lot of these older spiritual texts as well. I think that it is sort of like a new age. And it's a wonderful thing to be part of, actually, except for maybe being around in the Victorian era and happening to be a sociolete at the time or have a rich sponsor. This is basically the next best thing. This is at least as important an era for mysticism and the occult, and for folklore, for religious study, for comparative spirituality. This is at least as important an era as the 1890s through 1910s sort of golden age, the central golden age of occult study. Really, it starts sort of in the Napoleonic era, lasts through the early Great Depression, but that's really the sweet spot. Half the works that I'm working with are from that 2 or 3 decade period. There's a reason for that. I wouldn't be surprised if you have another awakening, a mass consciousness of literature now. You did briefly in the 2000s. Towards the end there, you had a lot of self-published works, some of which were very short and not very good. That were, again, that's sort of the charlatan side of things. Now you have some more, I think, decent academic studies of the occult going on. And what that's doing is it's creating a new sort of energy, you could say, or a new mindset in the human population. People are encountering systems that they haven't before. I've had You wouldn't believe how many messages I've gotten from places in West Africa about people asking me how to sell their soul to the devil in order to find a wife or get rich or something. That may not be the most authentic spiritual goal. It may not be realistic, but there's an interest there. That interest is what drove Western occultism too, over a century ago. Your great-grandparents were probably interested in the occult. Your parents probably aren't. It's very interesting. Some flapper doing satanic rituals back in the 1920s, some Victorian socialite going to China and buying scrolls, which may or may not have been authentic, in order to try to cobble together some Himalayan folk traditions. Very interesting times we live in. That's about all. Peace out.